There is a moment in the 8th century that most people have never heard of. A moment that happened in a field in central France, in October, in the cold. A moment so quiet in the history books that you could miss it entirely if you were reading quickly. And yet, some historians argue that what happened in that field decided what language you speak today. What religion shaped your laws? What civilization built the world you were born into? The argument is not small, it is not comfortable, and it is not settled, but it begins with a single fact that no one disputes. In 732, an Islamic army that had spent 11 years conquering everything in its path crossed the Pyrenees into France. And somewhere between the cities of Poitiers and Tours, it stopped. It never moved forward again. What you are about to hear is not the story of a religious war. It is something more complicated than that and more human. It is the story of two civilizations at the peak of their power, moving toward each other across a continent, and the single man who stood at the point of collision, with an army that had no business surviving what was coming. His name was Charles. They would later call him Martel, the Hammer. And before this story ends, you will understand exactly why. The year is 711, and everything begins not in France but in Spain, in a moment that takes less than 3 years to become one of the most dramatic military conquests in human history. The Umayyad Caliphate is the largest empire on earth, stretching from the borders of China in the east to the Atlantic coast of North Africa in the west. It has expanded with a speed and consistency that makes the Roman Empire look cautious by comparison. The armies that carry this expansion are not simply motivated by conquest. They carry a faith that is less than a century old, moving through the world with the energy of something new, something that has not yet learned to accept the idea of limits. In 711, a general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crosses the strait between North Africa and Spain with approximately 7,000 men. The Visigothic kingdom of Spain, weakened by decades of internal conflict and dynastic struggles, collapses with a speed that shocks even the people living through it. Within 3 years, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula is under Umayyad control. The speed is not luck. It is organization, motivation, military discipline, and the tactical genius of commanders who have spent decades learning how to break armies larger than their own. But here is what matters for this story. The conquest of Spain does not stop at the Pyrenees. It was never designed to. The natural continuation of what began in 711 is northward, into the Frankish lands that will one day become France. And in 717, the raids begin. Not invasions yet, probes, testing the edges of what lies beyond the mountains. Each year the raids go deeper. Each year they return with more. And each year the Frankish kingdoms, fragmented and politically unstable, fail to mount any coordinated response. By 720, the city of Narbonne on the Mediterranean coast of what is now southern France is under Umayyad control. The base is established. The road north is open, and the man who will use that road is Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus, a commander of significant experience and genuine ability, who understands that the conquest of Spain was always meant to be the beginning, not the end. In 732, he leads an army northward through the passes of the Pyrenees. The sources disagree dramatically on the size of this army. Medieval Christian chroniclers give numbers in the hundreds of thousands that are almost certainly exaggerated. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 20 and 80,000 men, with the truth probably in the middle range. What is not disputed is this: it is large, it is experienced. It has been winning for 2 decades, and it is moving north with the momentum of something that has not been seriously stopped since it began. The army moves through Aquitaine. The Duke of Aquitaine, Odo the Great, who has spent years maintaining his independence from both the Umayyad south and the Frankish north, meets Abd al-Rahman at the Battle of the River Garonne. His army is destroyed. Odo survives and flees north to ask for help from the one man in the Frankish world capable of providing it. the man he has spent years fighting against, the man he despises, the man he has no choice but to approach now. Charles. To understand what Charles means in 732, you need to understand what the Frankish kingdoms are in 732. They are not a unified nation. They are a collection of competing territories, held together by politics that are more violent than most wars. The nominal kings of the Merovingian dynasty sit on their thrones as figureheads, their real power having eroded over generations into the hands of the officials who actually run the kingdoms. These officials are called mayors of the palace, and the most powerful mayor of the palace in the Frankish world, the man who controls the military and the treasury and the machinery of actual governance, is Charles. He is the illegitimate son of a previous mayor of the palace. He came to power through a civil war that lasted years and cost thousands of lives. He has spent the 2 decades since consolidating control of the Frankish territories through a combination of military campaigns, political marriages, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that makes enemies out of people who expected to be allies. When Odo of Aquitaine arrives asking for help, Charles does not celebrate the humiliation of a man who spent years opposing him. He makes a calculation. The calculation is simple. If Abd al-Rahman's army continues north, it does not stop at Aquitaine. It moves into the Frankish heartland. And if the Frankish heartland falls, there is nothing between the Umayyad Caliphate and the English Channel. Charles has spent 20 years fighting to build something. He is not going to let it be consumed by an army that arrived from a different continent while he was busy. He marches south to meet Abd al-Rahman. What Charles brings is not a larger army. He almost certainly has fewer men than Abd al-Rahman. What he brings is something that the situation demands more than numbers. He brings the most battle-hardened infantry force in the Frankish world, trained and organized through 2 decades of constant warfare. And he brings a tactical mind that has already solved problems more complicated than this one. October 732. The exact location is uncertain. The sources call it somewhere between Poitiers and Tours, a place where Charles has chosen to make his stand. And the choice of ground is the first indication of what kind of commander he is. He does not meet Abd al-Rahman on the open plain where cavalry dominates. He positions his forces on high ground covered in forest and trees that neutralize the mobility advantage of the Umayyad horsemen. He turns a battle he could lose on open ground into a battle he can fight on his own terms. For 7 days, the 2 armies face each other. 7 days of positioning, probing, psychological pressure. 7 days during which Abd al-Rahman is trying to read what Charles is doing, and Charles is making sure Abd al-Rahman cannot read anything at all. This is not a detail. This delay is strategy. Every day that passes in October is a day colder and more difficult for an army that marched from southern Spain. Every day that passes is a day Abd al-Rahman cannot be certain about his supply lines, his flanks, or what is moving in the forests he cannot see into. On the 7th day, Abd al-Rahman decides to attack. What follows is one of the strangest battles in the early medieval period, because it does not follow the pattern that the Umayyad army has used to win for 2 decades. The cavalry charges that broke the Visigothic army, the Attanian army, the armies of North Africa and the Middle East, crash against the Frankish infantry and not break through. The Franks have formed what the sources describe as a wall, a dense, immovable formation of infantry standing shoulder to shoulder in the terrain Charles selected specifically to prevent the cavalry from finding space to build momentum. The charges come. They do not break the wall. They come again. The wall holds. And while the battle grinds in the center, Charles is watching for the moment he has been waiting for since he positioned his forces a week ago. That moment arrives in the form of a rumor, or perhaps an actual Frankish raid. The sources are unclear, but what happens is this. Word spreads through the Umayyad camp that the Frankish forces are attacking the baggage train, where Abd al-Rahman's army has stored the plunder from its march north through Aquitaine. Years of accumulated wealth, the incentive that helped motivate the march in the first place. Units begin to peel away from the battle to protect the camp. The formation that held through multiple cavalry charges begins to fragment, not because it was broken from the front, because it was pulled apart from the inside by men who were afraid of losing what they had already won. Abd al-Rahman sees what is happening. He tries to stop it. He rides into the fragmenting units to restore order, to redirect his men back to the battle that is still being fought. And in that moment, exposed, moving through chaos, he is surrounded and killed. The death of Abd al-Rahman does not end the battle instantly, but it removes the one thing holding the fragmented army together: command. Without command, the retreat that began as a tactical withdrawal becomes something else. It becomes flight. The Umayyad army retreats south. Charles does not pursue. This is a decision that confuses some historians, who see it as a missed opportunity. But Charles makes the calculation that pursuit of a large, experienced, and still dangerous army through terrain he does not control ends in disaster more often than victory. He holds his position. He lets them go, and he waits. The next morning, when Frankish scouts move forward to examine the Umayyad camp, they find it empty. The army that had spent years building momentum across 2 continents has withdrawn in the night and is heading back towards Spain. It never comes back in that strength. There are raids. There are skirmishes. There are further attempts to push north over the following decades. None of them reach what Tours reached. The high-water mark of the Umayyad advance into Western Europe is a field between Poitiers and Tours on an October day in 732. And the man who set that mark is Charles, who will spend the next 15 years consolidating what he saved that day into something that his grandson will turn into the Carolingian Empire. But here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, because the meaning of Tours has been argued about for 13 centuries, and the argument matters. The interpretation that dominated European historiography for a long time is dramatic and clean. Tours was the battle that saved Christian Europe. Without Charles, the Umayyad armies marched north. They crossed the Loire, they crossed the Seine, they reached the English Channel. Europe becomes part of the Islamic world. The history of Western civilization takes a completely different path. This interpretation gave Tours its reputation as one of the decisive battles of world history and gave Charles his epithet, Martel, the hammer that stopped the tide. The revisionist interpretation, which became influential in the 20th century and remains significant today, pushes back on almost every part of this. It argues that the Umayyad army at Tours was not an invasion force in the fullest sense. It was a large raiding expedition, extended far from its supply base, operating at the edge of its logistical capacity. Even if Abd al-Rahman had won at Tours, the argument goes, the Umayyad Caliphate lacked the infrastructure to hold and govern territory this far from its centers of power. The internal politics of the Caliphate, which would shatter into civil war within 2 decades of Tours, made sustained expansion into Western Europe structurally impossible regardless of what happened in that field. In this reading, Tours was significant but not civilization-defining. It was the place where a raiding army met a prepared defense and lost, which produced political consequences without necessarily changing the fundamental direction of history. And then there is a third reading, one that sits between the two and may be closest to the actual truth. Tours mattered not because it stopped an unstoppable force, but because it demonstrated something that changed what was possible. Before Tours, the Frankish kingdoms had failed repeatedly to mount any effective resistance to the advance from the south. After Tours, that changed. Charles Martel emerged from the battle as the undisputed military power in Western Europe, with a reputation that extended far beyond the Frankish lands. His victory created the political foundation from which his son Pepin and his grandson Charlemagne built the structures that shaped medieval European civilization. In this reading, what Charles won at Tours was not just a battle, it was the authority to build something. And what got built, in the century after Tours, was the political and cultural framework of medieval Europe as we understand it. But there is something else about Tours that gets lost in the argument about historical significance, something human. Something that belongs to the men who stood in that formation on that cold October morning and held against cavalry charges. They had no guarantee of surviving. The Frankish infantry at Tours were not crusaders. They were not fighting for the survival of Western civilization. They did not know they were standing at a hinge point of history. They were fighting because Charles had assembled them and told them to hold. Some of them were professionals hardened by 2 decades of Frankish civil war. Some of them were levies who had never stood in a battle line before. All of them, when the horses came, had to make the same choice. The choice that every infantry soldier facing cavalry has to make. To hold the line or to break, they held. And in holding, they gave Charles the time he needed. They gave him the moment when the Umayyad formation fragmented. They gave him the battle. And through the battle, they gave everything that came after. History has a tendency to remember commanders, to give battles to the generals who designed them. Charles Martel is remembered. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi is remembered, as much as any defeated commander is remembered. What the history books do not name are the men in the formation. The men whose names were never written down because they were not the kind of people history wrote about. The men who held, and yet without them, none of the rest of it happens. Not Charles's authority, not the Carolingian Empire, not the political framework of medieval Europe, not any of the chain of consequences that flows from a cold October day in 732. There is a version of the Battle of Tours that is clean and simple. The hammer of God stopped the tide of Islam at the gates of Europe. Civilization was saved. History turned. There is another version that is more cautious and more qualified. A large raid met a prepared defense. The political consequences were significant. The civilizational stakes may have been overstated. Both versions are true in their own way. Both versions miss something. What they miss is the texture of the actual day, the cold, the 7 days of waiting, the sound of cavalry building speed on the other side of the tree line, the moment when the first charge hit the Frankish wall and the wall did not move, and the decision, made by thousands of ordinary men who had no idea what they were deciding, to stand in that line one more time. That is what Tours actually was. Not a clean story about civilization versus civilization. Not a simple military calculation about supply lines and logistical limits. It was a day when something that had been moving for 20 years without stopping, stopped, because the men in the way decided it would. Charles Martel died in 741, 9 years after Tours. He died having never been king, though he ruled as completely as any king. He died having built a military and political structure that his descendants would use to crown themselves emperors and shape a continent. He died with the reputation of the man who held the line when no one else could. Whether Tours saved Western civilization or simply redirected a raiding army is a question that historians will continue to argue. But this is not in dispute. Something was built in the century after Tours that would not have been built the same way, or perhaps at all, without Charles. And something was stopped on that October day that had been moving without pause for a generation. Whether that something would have continued indefinitely, whether it would have consumed everything in its path, we cannot know. History does not show us the roads not taken. What history shows us is the road that was taken. The road that went through a field between Poitiers and Tours, past a wall of Frankish infantry that refused to move, to a world that was shaped by what survived that day. Whether that world was inevitable or contingent, better or worse than what might have been, is a question with no clean answer. What is not a question is this. On an October day in 732, a man named Charles positioned his forces on high ground in the cold, waited 7 days, and held. And what he held against has never been fully calculated and probably never will be, because that is the nature of the battles that shape history. We know what happened. We can only guess at what would have happened if they had gone the other way. The hammer fell, the line held, and the world that came after was built on what survived.